Hello, everyone. Hope you're all having a great time at KubeCon Barcelona. I'm Dee Kumar. I head up marketing with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
Yeah, hi there. My name is Arun Gupta. I'm a principal technologist at Amazon Web Services. I'm also the CNCF board member representative. So today we'll talk about the serverless landscape and the event-driven futures. So let's talk about a little bit, first of all, as a level set, what does serverless really mean? Serverless really mean, these are sort of the 4 core tenets of when you are looking at serverless. Now, let's look at the top left, first of all. Serverless does have servers, but those are not the ones that you manage. From your perspective, you build your application, you deploy your application, and then you don't know, who's managing those servers. So you're really focusing on the application. That is your core competency. That is what you excel in, and let somebody else manage a server. So there is no managing of servers. There is no provisioning of servers, no patching of servers. None of that has to happen from your side of it. Go on the top right. You're given a knob, a dial, to run your application. And if you want to scale your application, if all of a sudden your application becomes popular, and instead of like 10 requests per second, you're getting 1,000 requests per second, your app automatically scales. You don't have to scale it. There is no cluster provisioning that needs to happen behind the scene. That has to happen automatically for you. Then go on the highly available side of it. So we're going in a clockwise direction. The app is highly available. So I work at AWS. At AWS, we have this concept of a region, which is a physical location around the world. And that region has typically multiple availability zones. So you can architect your application to be highly available, but then you need to make those calls. You need to architect your application to be deployed across multiple availability zones. With serverless, the application is highly available. So you make sure that the application is deployed in that sense. And last but not the least, you do not pay for the storage of the function in the cloud. You only pay for the execution time. And from your perspective, that is the right cost that you need to pay. So if you are storing, for example, a Lambda function, nothing for it. But then you are paying for really the sub-second time that it is executing, and that's your right thing over here. Let's talk about some of the patterns that we have seen across our customers on what does it really mean. So on the bottom left, what you see is basically where your typical classical monolithic applications are sitting over there. So we look at how customers are migrating. What they want to do is they want to get to the top right quadrant here. So the first set of customers, what we see is they lift and shift the application into the cloud. Now, what they've done is they've gotten rid of their on-prem data centers. Now they're running in the cloud. That gives them that somewhat agility. Then the second step for them is to start using containers. And then that gives them a little bit more agility, because containers gives you that whole impedance mismatch or lack of impedance mismatch between your different compute environments. Or then there are customers who say, we're going to migrate to containers first, because we want to standardize our deployment, development architecture, and then go to the cloud. And then there are customers like Fannie Mae, which is an Amazon customer, who just say, we're going to go full blow into serverless. So we're going to right away start using Lambda functions, deploy everything into the cloud, actually build our applications so that it is microservices oriented, and everything is event driven. So you store something in a queue or a notification or an API, and then I'm going to call that Lambda function. So that's the common pattern that we have seen. Then the second pattern is where we have seen where in the IT business, typically, what you do is you're doing one-off jobs, and that job runs once a day, or maybe at a certain point of time. You don't want to manage a cluster for that. So in case you don't want to manage a cluster for that, that's exactly where Lambda fits in. So you can say, hey, by the way, I just want to run this function once an hour, once every 6 hours, so why pay unnecessary cost for that? So it automatically just triggers that Lambda function, and then runs it, and then you get it back. Now, as you are moving along in that direction, you realize, oh, by the way, this job is actually getting done in a lot lesser cost, lot more efficient, highly available. I'm only paying for my execution time. That's where it starts becoming strategic. Your CTO, your CIO kind of starts looking at it. Oh, how about instead of just doing in a job in IT, let's take a look at the entire department. or an entire business application and see if we can start converting this into sort of the serverless landscape part of it. And that's where you start looking at agility and how rapidly I can deploy and deliver value to my customers. And then the third pattern that we have seen is called as strangler pattern. Now, strangler wines, this is a pattern that Martin Fowler has written about. Strangler wines are the wines that he found at the coast of Australia with his, during one of his vacation with his wife. Strangler vines really go on the tree. They start from the top, and then they go down to the root. And then they start growing on the tree itself, where they become the host, and the tree disappears. That is a pattern that we have commonly seen in our customers, where they start with a monolithic application, they chip a part of the monolithic application, they create an API to it, and make a microservice out of it. And then they chip another part of it, and another part of it, and so on and so forth, until the monolith itself is kind of decomposed into multiple applications. And potentially each of those microservices are being run as a serverless function or a container or whatever way you want to call it. But it's a true microservices-oriented pattern that we have seen in our customers being used all over the place.
So last year, NewStack, they did a survey, and 500 people responded to the survey. So this essentially is the response that they received. And basically what this shows is FaaS is pretty much what developers, it changes the way developers are creating and building applications. And based on that, this essentially shows the usage of FaaS. As you can see, here are the top 10 different vendors. And again, FaaS is just one part of the serverless stack, and it's not the whole serverless story in itself. And AWS Lambda, I think from a usage perspective, 70% of these people who responded saying that they're using AWS Lambda from a FaaS perspective. So Arun, can you give us a little bit more insight into how AWS Lambda is being used by developers?
Sure. I mean, as you rightly said, FaaS, people often confuse that is FaaS serverless. FaaS is just a compute part of serverless. And if you realize the title of the talk is event-driven futures. So FaaS is just the compute part of it, where you're taking a function and somebody else is managing that function for you in terms of the deployment. But if you look at, go back a slide. So if you look at AWS Lambda is a foundational service for Amazon. The service was launched in 2014. Roughly 90 to 95% of our roadmap is driven by customers. And then 5 to 10%, where we think that, this is what customers might need. So AWS Lambda is a classical example on how we thought the customers might need it, and it seems like they loved it. So it's a foundational service. That means it's run on all AWS region. Anytime we launch a new region, the service starts over there. A classical use case, a customer use case I like to quote over there is FINRA. FINRA is financial regulation a nonprofit that basically 99% of equity trade in US goes through FINRA, and 65% of option trades goes through FINRA. And the response time for FINRA is super critical, because based upon the rules that they run on each trade, they need to quickly say that if the market is good to go or the market needs to shut down. It can actually impact the US stock market. Before migrating to AWS Lambda, they were taking about 3 minutes average response time and 7-minute peak response time. When they migrated to Lambda, they were consistently getting a minute of response time. And the scale we are talking about for AWS Lambda is they're running about 500 billion, that is 500 billion validations per day. So I would encourage, if you're looking at that scale, take a look at that case study, how it talks about why AWS Lambda is so popular and how customers are using it. Now talk about the developer experience. It's super important that the languages that matter to you are supported in Lambda. So in Lambda, for example, a bunch of languages are supported out of the box. So there is Node, there is Java, there is Ruby, there is Go, there is PowerShell. You pick your favorite language, and it's supported over there. Last year at AWS reInvent, we also introduced something called as Bring Your Own Language. And basically what we introduced is a new Lambda runtime API. And using that Lambda runtime API, we open sourced C++ and Rust runtime. So now developers have written C++ functions that can be managed as a Lambda function, or Rust. And we have lots of examples by partners. So COBOL is back, PHP is back, Fortran is back. If you are any of the fanboys for any of those languages, Fortran used to be my college language. So those custom runtimes can actually be now managed in the cloud for you.
So let's talk about serverless within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So just to get the community involved, there's a working group that was created within serverless, and then the goal for this working group was to figure out the intersection between cloud native and serverless. And so the outcome of the work that came out of the serverless working group was essentially a white paper. So CNCF sponsored the white paper, and it was authored by a few specialists from NewStack. And this white paper, if you guys haven't seen it, I would highly encourage that you read the white paper. It really has a lot of great content, just in terms of breaking down the whole stack of serverless, and it's not just limited to fast, because that essentially is somewhat the majority of the understanding today. And the other artifact that came out of the work from the serverless working group is the serverless landscape. I think most of you might have known about the CNCF landscape. So the CNCF landscape is essentially to represent all the cloud native technologies that exist. And today the landscape, there's a joke that goes around, it's called Hellscape, because we represent close to 600 products or projects within the landscape, and then the serverless landscape is a subset of it. It's essentially to create more awareness for folks who are not involved with serverless or just new to serverless, and just to understand all the different companies and products and projects that belong to the serverless landscape. Also want to give out a shout out to Andre. I'm not sure if you're here. Hey, thank you. So he's the rock star who actually built the serverless landscape. And I think what is magical about the landscape is, I would say 3 years ago, the landscape was very static in nature. So if there was someone, a company who wanted to represent or put a logo and represent all the details into the landscape, it was very manual, and it kind of limited participation from the community. And so now the landscape has, this essentially is how the landscape has grown, where I talked about the 600 different companies that exist. And today, due to the work of Andre, I think he's enabled what I would say collaborative editing. It's very dynamic in nature. We do get a lot of requests in terms of how do I represent or how do I add my product to the landscape. It is super easy. I know all of you are developers, and GitHub is something you must be using all the time. So this should be extremely easy. There is a YAML file where all you need is to follow some really strict specifications. 4 lines is all we ask. Is you enter your company name, URL. We do ask for a Crunchbase URL because that's where we get all the financial stats. And then we also ask that the logo should be in SVG format. And the reason for that is this logo helps scale across different modern browsers, so you don't have to worry about pixelation or anything of that sort. And the other thing you can do is you can fork your own branch from the master branch. You can try it out. You could also look at it from staging server. We use Netlify, which spins up a staging server where you can actually see how your product or project is represented in the serverless landscape. And then the last step is if everything looks good to you, you write a comment, and then you push that request, and then someone from CNCF, we just look at it to make sure that it's represented correctly, and then the product actually shows up in the landscape. And if there is time today, I think it's really simple, but I'm happy to share a demo in terms of how you can actually represent your company, your product into a very specific category, and how you could just do that on the fly. And I can happily take you through that. And so with that, so Arun, can you talk about exactly what the different stacks are in serverless, and then where does the functions piece of it actually fit in?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at it, look at different cloud providers. They have their own storage. They have their own API gateway. They have their own functions. So if I look at, say, AWS, for example, there is S3, there is API gateway, there is Lambda. Now, the idea is, we talk about the event-driven future. So the whole aspect is where the functions are really the gluing between all of these different services. So something happens in the storage, you call a function. Something happens in the database, you call a function. Something happens in the API management, somebody is calling your REST API, you call a function, and then you return the response back. So that's sort of the whole idea between different, but pick a cloud that you want to run it. Now, let's say you want to have this up and running across multiple clouds. And but by that, what I mean is, let's say somebody is storing an image in a Google Cloud Storage, and they want to run a Rust Lambda function in AWS Cloud. Or somebody is storing an image in S3, for example, and I want to call an Azure function. How does that work, basically? So that's sort of the missing piece right now, because within the cloud, of course, it works very well. And that's sort of the whole premise of cloud events.
And so now that we have the serverless working group, the TOC, which is the Technical Oversight Committee, who are a part of CNCF, or represent CNCF essentially, what they have done is now they've created a C events type of working group to further along what Arun was saying is to enable events, a platform, or I would say more like a specification, because we all live in a multi-cloud, multi-service type of environment. We have to make sure that there is a common standardized way or specification of events that is being able to talk to different different types of clouds or platforms or systems. So, and one of the things is, so essentially the specification is a metadata that can be used regardless of the cloud or the platform or the system that you're using. And then one of the things I also want to mention is the cloud events. It came to the CNCF as a sandbox project, and now that the specification has furthered along, there is a proposal in place for it to move from the sandbox stage to the incubating stage, as we have 3 different stages within CNCF, just depending on the adoption as well as the community health and growth. We move these projects along through different stages, and the last stage is graduation. And just in terms of who is adopting the cloud event spec, as you can see, it's Microsoft, SAP. We're getting a lot of support from other vendors as well. Arun is going to touch on how Knative is actually using cloud events and how they are complementary to each other. And I think I touched on the incubator status. And now with all of this, Arun, can you talk about containers, serverless, infrastructure, and how does that all fit in?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is KubeCon, right? So we could talk about not just serverless. How is the serverless world relevant in terms of Kubernetes world? So let's talk about that. Now, one of the things that our customers came to us is that it's cool that you are deploying Lambda functions. You're giving us Lambda functions. We love it. But we have already, before Lambda function came in or around Lambda function came in, we've already invested quite heavily into the containers land of it. So then we looked at something called as AWS Fargate, where we don't want the customers to do undifferentiated heavy lifting for them. From their perspective, they just want to get it up and running on how easy it is to fire up a container, and you manage it for me. So just very much like Lambda, we have those different Fargate configurations. So you pick a vCPU, you pick like the memory that you need, and you get that one dial. So there are about 40 different configurations that are available that can get you up and running with Fargate. So you say, here is my container, here is my vCPU, here is my memory, and then we manage it. It's just like Lambda, it scales to whatever extent you want to scale it to, and then it works like a charm. Now, what about Kubernetes in that case? So that's where the project Knative, this is an open source project, not a CNCF sponsored project at this point of time, but this is how you do serverless with Kubernetes essentially. So this is a Kubernetes built on top of Kubernetes, kind of aligning with the theme that you saw in the keynote this morning. Kubernetes is a platform for platforms. So that's where sort of Knative is sitting on top of it, where you can build, deploy, and manage your serverless workloads. So all you do is, here is my parts pack, go run it, go manage it for me. Works very much like a charm. And another part that it focuses on is how it promotes the idiomatic developer experience. So you're not caring about the language typically. You're caring about, I'm building an application using Ruby on Rails, or Django, or Spring Boot, whatever comes to your mind. So it provides that developer experience. And then it also adds, you're building GitOps, you're building manual ops, you're building Docker ops. What kind of ops methodology are you using? And it easily incorporates that as part of the entire workflow. So essentially, there are three components to Knative. There's a building part of it, where is how you build the container part of it, how do you serve the container, and then the eventing part of it. And in the eventing is where the cloud events become relevant. So Knative, of course, gives you that ability to manage your serverless workloads. But again, just a random container running somewhere as a function is not very helpful. So you want to make sure that there are events that are triggering that function. And being in a cross-cloud environment, depending upon how your Kubernetes cluster is configured, that's exactly where cloud events kind of kick in. Now, is that everywhere? Is that enough in terms of innovation? Is that enough that we're doing in the serverless world to help customers be successful? What about the infrastructure? We talked about sort of at the function layer, we talked about at the container layer, but then last year at reInvent, Amazon introduced Firecracker. Firecracker is a brand new virtual machine manager, essentially, and this is a project that we looked at as we were running Lambda workloads, as we were running Fargate workloads, that how do we achieve more efficiency in terms of running these workloads? I don't want to have one container per EC2 instance. That's not very efficient for me. So that's exactly where we introduced this open source VMM. You can go to firecracker-microvm.io to get all the details. But essentially what it gives you is gives you the security and isolation of traditional virtual machines with the speed and density of containers. And I'll give you a little bit more background on that. So if you go to the next slide here. So what it gives you is it gives you security from the ground up. It really has that minimal device model, like a Word I/O, a Word block, one block keyboard. So really, literally 3 or 4 devices that are available to you. So because the exposed area is not that big, it really gives you a lot more security. It gives you speed by design, because now what I can do is I can launch a micro VM in less than 125 milliseconds. So essentially what I can do is, instead of running a EC2 instance, sure, it runs in nested virtualization. So Joe Beda actually talked about Firecracker and one of the TGI Kate series running Firecracker on Google Cloud. But the real advantage of this is when you're running on a bare metal machine in your on-prem data center. So what you would do is essentially you will fire up a bare metal machine, and then you can launch as many micro VMs as you want over there. And that's what gives you the density. That's what gives you the ability to fire up the micro VM quickly. And it's very well sized for your container or for your Lambda function. And last but not the least, it gives you that scale and efficiency because the footprint of each micro VM is less than 5 megabytes. So at reInvent, we made a call that the plan is for Lambda to 100% move to Firecracker. And we're working with a lot of other technologies as well, which is basically what the next slide is. So if you look at it, Lambda is going to move 100% to Firecracker. Fargate is heading towards that direction as well. But then what we were excited is at last KubeCon, we had really good meetings with the Kata Containers folks. Now, Kata Containers uses QEMU as a default VMM. But then one of their longest customer ask has been that QEMU is a little bit heavyweight VMM. They wanted a little bit lighter weight VMM. So because of the way Kata containers are created, it is a pluggable VMM. So they quickly adapted it, and they actually sent a pull request by which Kata containers can now actually use Firecracker as the micro VM technology. And then, of course, we are also looking at Firecracker and container integration, which really would allow you to run a Kubernetes pod in a micro VM. So think about the scalability that it gives you. You don't have to use really an EC2 instance as a security boundary. You can truly run multi-tenant data plane. So this is Werner Vogel's. This is a snapshot from him from reInvent a couple of years ago. So, and this really summarizes for me that serverless really means just write your application. That's all. That's all you should care about. Then you compose your application on what events it would trigger, and that's all it should be about. Let somebody else manage the servers for you. Yes, there are servers in serverless. There are absolutely servers, but somebody else is managing them for you. But from your perspective, all you care about is Write your application, let somebody else take care of high availability, let somebody else take care of scaling, let somebody else take care of storing. You are only running your application and only paying for that application.
So lastly, in terms of how do all of us get involved, I think we highly encourage you start building serverless apps and functions. It's always easy to get started. The second thing, like I said before, is it's easy to update the serverless landscape. It's a very simple YAML file where you would put 3 or 4 lines of tagging that needs to happen, and it's dynamic and it's very easy to do, so you can update it anytime, all the time. Please do join the serverless working group. Like I said, the serverless working group now is very much focused on the C events spec. And then there is also another initiative that is underway where they talk about the event workflow and what that exactly means. So that's another subset project which is a part of the overall serverless working group that is where they primarily look at C events, and then there is the events workflow. And then there are all kinds of channels that are made available. So there is a serverless email channel that has access to, so if you have access to the slides and click on the links here, you'll be able to join these different channels. There is a weekly call, serverless, that happens on Thursdays. There is a separate Git repo that's available for cloud events. Please do join the mailing list for cloud events. It's separate cloud events as well as serverless. The other thing that I was told, the co-chair, Doug Davis, he's very well known, and I would say he's an expert in serverless, as well as Mark Peek. And when I talked to them, I think one of the feedback that Doug gave me was he apparently went to a few other conferences, and when he asked people in terms of how many of them are using serverless in production, I think there were very few hands that went up. So one of the things that we would really appreciate is if you could please share some of the key use cases, pain points, or challenges that customers are actually finding in terms of moving or using serverless in production, and the way you could help us in terms of sharing that feedback. As CNCF, we also have our end user community, so you could look up the end user community. Cheryl Hung, who runs the end user community, she's always looking for such requirements and feedback. So that would be one place for you all to share any specific use cases or customer requirements that you're aware of, and some of the challenges that they're finding in terms of using serverless, because we want to make that journey for our customers really easy. And then having worked with AWS and other vendors, we are happy to kind of work with them and figure out what exactly are their pain points. So it's really important for us to understand the different use cases or pain points from folks who are actually in this journey of serverless. I guess that's about it.
Well, I mean, we both are on Twitter. Feel free to ping us over there if you have any questions, or otherwise we'll be hanging out at the conference as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.